but he's kind of come to some acknowledgement that yes, indeed, that the Poles may have a point about copying. Is kind of the way he's kind of phrased it to kind of smooth things over for his own interests, of course. So there's two contesting points of view here that are developing within Poland, in which this museum, I think that the creation of this museum and the recovery of the Rising as part of the historical memory is an effort to reestablish the continuity of the Polish historical memory that was shattered by Soviet and Nazi occupations and genocide. And in so doing, the proponents of this have adopted strongly patriotic language and symbols, and that little description I read to you from the guidebook, I think, illustrates that. The second contesting point of view is this sort of post-communist point of view, and it's adopted by many Western historians who see any expression of nationalism as incipient fascism. And in so doing, they have gone back and adopted a kind of updated version of Stalinist-era rhetoric. And this is, I think, where things stand. I think I'll finish up by saying one more thing about the rest of it. Yesterday, I was in a Polish store here in Hamtramck, and I picked up this little Osprey book, Warsaw, 1944. It's a very popular little series. Nicely done little, military histories of different events around the world. But the fact that the Warsaw Uprising has sort of made it into this series indicates a certain level of acceptance in outside of Poland for some understanding. It's maybe not as yet, a major event, even though this was the largest urban uprising in history. It was the largest massacre of civilians and the second largest military atrocity during the Second World War, larger than Babi Yar. The murders in Ochota were larger than Babi Yar by far in terms of military massacre of civilians. But nevertheless, sort of a little bit of an increasing acceptance, increasing understanding outside of Poland. But when you go, some of you have been to the museum, I know some of you mentioned that, but if you go to the museum, it is, especially if you are sort of new to Polish history, again, I strongly recommend you read up a little bit on it. But it's a fascinating approach to creating a museum and the sort of recovery of historical memory. With that, I thank you, and I will gladly entertain any questions. I should have actually I was going to put this one up. This is a monument that's actually quite near to the Ghetto Monument in terms of close walking distance. This is a monument that's put up just a few years ago to Poles who were deported to the Soviet Union. So there's some of these other monuments are beginning to appear in Warsaw. And again, remember, this is, you go to other parts of Poland, you may find other monuments, but because it's the capital city, it matters so much more. You can put up a monument in Peoria versus something on the wall in Washington D.C. It's a whole different feel to it. Questions, comments? Yes.
It was a very interesting lecture. I enjoyed it a great deal. But I encountered a little bit of discussion about actually potential harm this visit to this museum could do to Polish children. What is your opinion on that?
You mean in terms of trauma?
Yeah, trauma, or not only trauma, but actually giving them this very simplistic version of Uprising, so stripping it of its complexities, and there were a lot of them, especially endangering all of the civilians in the Uprising. That would be just one, but there is, of course, many more. And that was discussed to some extent in Polish press, so I just wonder what's your opinion on that?
That's interesting because my sense is that in terms of what museums can do, and part of this is there's a limit to what you can do with a museum in terms of showing, like say a historical monograph, where you can go into 300 pages of detail and discuss all the nuances. In a museum display, it's very hard to do that. And what surprised me compared to many of the sort of quote-unquote new historical museums that you see, and it'll be interesting, by the way, to see how the new museum of the Jewish museum that they're creating in Warsaw will compare to this one. I'm going to go back and do a little article on that, I hope, when that one's open. But I was surprised at how much detail there is there, how much complexity compared to other museums. Now, compared to the reality of the event, it does simplify, but all museums must do that. And so I think, but a lot of the students need to be getting this in the schools. So if they're not being prepared for this in advance, then it would be a very serious problem. But one thing that did happen before is that quite a number of Polish students were taken to places like Auschwitz. My wife, for example, when she was a child, she grew up in Katowice, was taken to Auschwitz I can't remember how old she was. In fact, she had to be given sedatives before she went. She did some mild sedatives. She was, I don't know how many students did that. That was the so there was at least in the previously and that was again 1970s. Not so much concern about the safety of children, and I think there's nothing particularly graphic in the museum, and I think most children, and having seen TV in Poland is not all that different now from TV in the United States in many ways, and what children are exposed to, I wouldn't say that it's too much for children. I mean, for younger children, yes, there are aspects of it, but I think if they're prepared well, it would not be a problem. That's just my own take on it. I'm not a child psychologist. I think that's something that a sort of specialist on child psychology would probably have a different answer to.
But actually, there's like another aspect to it. Just that it was criticized for giving this this making it so appealing. This uprising was just such a great thing that, and so that's sort of a danger.
Yeah.
Instead of just seeing it as a catastrophe too. And
that's a deep debate, and that's a debate that the museum doesn't. I think it's a good point. There's a debate among historians about whether the rising was necessary, and I have colleagues who are, I would say, further to the right than I am, put it that way, who say that I would have never done this. I'm a patriot. I believe myself a Polish patriot. I would never have done this. I would never have, sent Boy Scouts out against Panzers. Okay, I would never have done this. So I think there's this very serious debate over whether this was a good idea and whether this was in fact a tragic mistake. And I think that making it, to back up your point, I think there are, for example, coloring books, showing different aspects of the, here you can draw a picture of a picture of the Kubush tank, or a picture of a son of a girl guide, and it does make it look, important or heroic or somehow attractive to young people. But I think this is part of that question of this awkwardness that I sense in the museum, this sense of what is the approach, how much, because this was suppressed for so long, how much patriotism is okay, and how much sort of goes over the line to sort of promoting something we don't want. And I don't think, my sense of the museum is I don't think they thought about that, at least very consciously on a deep level. And I think that's maybe where some of the problem comes in.
I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. You said this was the largest civilian massacre, or uprising?
It was the largest civilian uprising, yeah, in terms of the sort of total, larger than Paris in, certainly World War II, and larger than, the Paris Commune. And it was, in terms of the number of, sort of one incident of military taking people out and shooting them, was larger than Babi Yar, was larger than any other in the Second World War.